Welcome, everybody, to the March Chemical Consultants Network meeting. I'm Mike Michaelzak, the chair of CCN. For those of you who don't know, Chemical Consultants Network is a group of chemists and chemical engineers that provides guidance, expertise, and resources to members who are consulting, who might be interested in consulting, or might be thinking they might be downsized down the road and they want to learn some more about possible post-career choices. We are a topical group of the Philadelphia section of the ACS. And we also hold monthly meetings. As you know, this is our March meeting on topics of interest of consultants and scientists. And for $35 per year, you can join CCN. Paid members can create a web page on our website to attract potential clients. And so you can sign up to be a member at chemconsultants.org. And Joanne posted the link to our website in the chat. So you can just copy it out of the chat if you want, or save it, bookmark it in your browser. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg Wells, who's the secretary of CCN, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Mike. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Sandra Bihary Waltz. I know Sandy from her husband, Sam. He's our owner and managing director at expertnation.com and its subsidiary ccon.com. We work with a large network of consultants in the areas of science, technology, and business development. And we're pleased to have Sandy as part of our network as well. She has 30 years of pharmaceutical industry experience and has worked across the pharmaceutical industry at both large and small companies alike, including AstraZeneca, GSK, Otsuka, and PRA/ICON, which is a global clinical research organization. She's also worked as a contract subject matter expert for the Biochemical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA, and as a drug development leader advisor for the Department of Defense. She currently serves as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Aclaris Therapeutics, who specialize in the treatment for immune inflammatory conditions such as rheumatoid and psoriatic arthritis and other conditions. Her areas of expertise include oncology and cardiovascular, regulatory affairs, strategy development, and counsel. With experience with antiviral, antimicrobial, and anti-infective products, as well as products in development for chemical, biological, radiation, and nuclear injury, with a track record of approved NDAs and SNDAs and pediatric and orphan disease programs. She also is a strong advocate for mentoring and growing individuals and teams. Sandy holds a bachelor's degree in nursing from Carlow University in Pittsburgh, a master's in nursing from Widener University in Chester, PA, and is a doctoral candidate in business administration with Wilmington University. In 2018, Sandy was awarded the Carlow Laureate Award. Carlow Laureates are alumni whose work, thought, and action demonstrate the highest standards of professional accomplishment and leadership, whether in their chosen discipline, in academics, or through community service. In 2019, Sandy also received a Women in Business Award from Delaware Today Publications for her career in the pharmaceutical industry and contributions to her community. Sandy's actively involved in numerous civic, community, industry, and faith-based leadership and services. And after that exhausting list of accomplishments and experience, I'd like to, without further ado, give the virtual floor over to Sandy, who will speak to us tonight about the world of regulatory affairs today. Sandy, the virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you, and I use that term loosely. But Greg asked me last year to speak to your group, and unfortunately, the first time we were scheduled, I had a conflict. So I'm happy to be here tonight to speak with all of you. I have a presentation that runs about 30 minutes, give or take, on the world of regulatory affairs now. And it's fairly high level. It's really up to you whether you want to ask questions during the presentation or whether you want to hold them at the end. I'm good either way. If a lot of you are like me, if you have a question, you need to ask it right away. Otherwise, it just kind of leaks out your ear. So it's really up to you how you want to do it. As I said, I'm good either way. So I'm going to share my screen. So, and again, if you want to ask questions during this time, then please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we can chat at the end. So as Greg said, I'm here to talk about the world of pharma regulatory today. Of course, every presentation has to begin with a disclaimer. And mine is that these are my information and my opinions. They don't imply any expression of opinion on the part of Expert Nation or on the company with whom I work, Aclaris Pharmaceuticals. And this presentation is going to focus primarily on new chemical entities. I'm not going to talk about generics, biosimilars, or biologics. Those are completely different and discrete areas. Okay, so regulatory affairs, what exactly is it? Now, regulatory affairs encompasses a number of different areas. I focus on the pharmaceutical industry, but as Michael and I were talking earlier, that really applies to a number of different areas for agriculture and for chemicals, and then across the board for a number of different things, and can encompass things like customs, imports, exports, auditing, and things of that nature. So it really is fairly large. In the United States, our main customer is the Food and Drug Administration. Regulatory professionals usually have responsibility for the following areas, and it's to ensure that the companies with whom we work comply with all the regulations and laws pertaining to their business, no matter what that is. We work with federal, state, and local authorities and personnel on specific issues. And again, this is working with such agencies as the Food and Drug Administration, European Medicines Agency, the EMA, and then other regulatory agencies worldwide. And I'll just touch on those briefly as our presentation and our chat goes along. Regulatory affairs professionals also advise companies on the regulatory aspects and the climate that would affect proposed activities. For example, describing the regulatory climate around issues such as promotion of prescription drugs. There are very specific laws of things that you can say and things that you can't say. I think, one thing that's a very good example is the commercials that you see on television, the direct to consumer, when they're talking about a specific drug, and they'll tell you how great the drug is, and then spend the next 30 seconds telling you all the things that can go wrong. And that through the FDA, that's referred to as fair balance. Some people would argue that there's no balance in there, but that's not what the agency sees. Regulatory affairs professionals also provide strategic advice and counsel to companies to provide competitive counsel and information. What have other companies done in the same therapeutic area, and how can you leverage what other companies have done to help the company that you're working with? There's a longstanding history of regulatory affairs. The healthcare industry was first to be significantly regulated in the modern era, as opposed to other industries. Much of this regulation has stemmed from avoiding the repetition of disasters and has tended to be led by the USA just because of the size of the market and our technological lead. I've got a number of different items here that identify what has created different portions of the law and has helped the Code of Federal Regulations to evolve the way it has. Back in 1902, there was a diphtheria endemic, and there were all sorts of cures and other things that people were being told that they could take that literally, diphtheria was bad enough, but this just killed them. 1906 was the Pure Food and Drugs Act. This was really the primary precursor to the current Food and Drugs, FDA Food and Drugs and Cosmetic Act, which helped to enable companies or forced companies to look at how their drugs are not only developed and looking at how they're created, what you have in them, and also looking at safety. And the safety too is in the next 2 points for the elixir that led to the 1938 Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. And then everybody is familiar with thalidomide from the Kefauver-Harris amendments. And that really was specific around how drugs were investigated and the transparency and relaying of important, primarily safety and efficacy information. If people, I don't know if many people here remember, but thalidomide back in the late 50s and early 60s was developed to really help women with nausea during their pregnancies. And when women were having their babies, they were finding that they were missing limbs, or the babies were dwarfed, their limbs were dwarfed. And the companies who developed the thalidomide actually knew that. They just chose not to release that information because the sales were going through the roof. In 76, there is the medical device amendment with the Dalcon Shield. And then there's other things too. In the United States, the regulations are largely written directly into law and codified in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And you'll see 21 CFR referred to a number of different places. What guides regulatory affairs is a whole bunch of stuff. As I just alluded to in my earlier comment, 21 CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations. The two key ones that, from a new chemical entity perspective or new drugs, are 21 CFR 312 and all the subsets associated with that, which pertains to investigational new drugs. So those drugs that are currently being investigated in specific disease entities. 21 CFR 314 are new drugs. So these are drugs that have already been assessed, and they have been evaluated by the FDA and found to be safe and effective and have a reasonable benefit risk profile, and are therefore able to be marketed in the United States. Other pertinent regulations include quality assurance and compliance, promotion and advertising, as I mentioned just a wee bit ago, post-marketing surveillance and pharmacovigilance, and good clinical practices, or GXPs. There's good clinical practice, good manufacturing practice, good lab practice. And the good lab practice really has a lot to do with preclinical, non-clinical, or what we used to refer to as animal studies. We generally don't refer to animal studies any longer as animal studies because the PETA people got really upset about that. So we just changed what we call it. So they're either now called non-clinical studies or preclinical. What also guides regulatory affairs are federal initiatives. And these include things as the Generic Act, the Biosimilars Act, rare and orphan diseases, and also breakthrough therapies. And all of those have very discrete and specific regulations and guidances that go along with them. They're not generally things that are considered mainstream, but from a regulator's perspective, this requires an additional degree of expertise and knowledge to be able to work through those. All of the changes in the Code of Federal Regulations and federal initiatives have to be presented in the Federal Register. So those are all changes to regulations, guidances, new guidances, debarments, and other things of that nature are placed in the Federal Register. Now, the Federal Register is not just specific to Health and Human Services. The Federal Register presents information across the federal government. So it includes Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration. It can include like the NIH, NCI, and it can include the organizations for tobacco, for Native American studies. So it really is fairly exhaustive. It's actually a pretty good, if you have absolutely nothing to do any day, just get online and look at the Federal Register. It comes out daily. And just take a look at what's in there. It's really, really surprising what you can find in there. Regulatory affairs, when I started over 30 years ago, we used to joke around and say regulatory, the key to regulatory was that it was supposed to be safe and effective in a small white pill. And that's what everybody wanted. And if it were only that easy now, it's not. it's evolved into highly specialized fields, as I said, drugs and biologics, devices, combination products, compliance, pharmacovigilance, and quality assurance. All these various fields are in the FDA, and its FDA falls under the Department of Health and Human Services, and that consists of 9 center level organizations and 13 headquarter offices. So it's fairly complex. The next few slides that I have are organizational charts from the FDA, and it looks at the three main areas. The first one is just overall the Food and Drug Administration. And you can see that it looks, I mean, there's a lot of boxes. And each of the individual organizations, each of the individual groups has different groups underneath it. The areas that I have worked in primarily are Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, that's CBER, CDRH, which is the one that's next to it, so that's Devices and Radiologic Health, and CDER, which is Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And then on the far right-hand side is the second one in is the Oncology Center of Excellence. And I've spent quite a bit of time working with that group. Now, under each of those, and you'll have CBER and CDER that I'll show you in just a minute. And under each of those are various other divisions and departments. CDER is the one that most people work with when you're looking at new chemical entities. So as you can see, there are different offices. And again, inside of each individual office is another organizational chart. So it almost looks like an Amway scheme. There's a lot of different people trying to sometimes find the right person with whom to speak in the division or in the office can be somewhat of a challenge. You really have to be pretty good at investigating and following a piece of string to find out the individual with whom you like to speak and who can give you the answer that you're looking for. The biologics are things like vaccines, blood and blood products, tissues, and things of that nature. CBER is a much newer part of the organization than CDER. Now, when I say newer, it's about 20 years old, give or take, maybe a little bit more, maybe 25 years old. But you can see under here, the Office of Blood Research and Review, vaccines, tissues, and advanced therapies, so on and so forth. And it's important to note that even though on the organizational chart, and then there's also CDRH, but I'm not going to talk about that because that's a whole different beast. But one of the things I think that is important to recognize is that, again, while these seem to be discrete entities, the two, CDER and CBER, work very closely with one another. So if there's a product, for instance, if you're looking at an oncology product, and let's say you're looking at something for a specific type of lung cancer that has a biologic component to it, the two divisions will make a determination as to who's going to take the lead. Usually if most of the what drives the product to work is the biologic side, then CBER, the biologics group, will take the lead on that. If it's more from a drug side and the biologic is kind of the booster, then CDER will take the lead, and they'll use each other in consult with one another. And then just to add a level of complexity, if you have something that is considered a device, a drug device combination, so something, for instance, inhalers, if anybody has asthma and you use Advair or anything like that, that's considered a combination product, a drug device. People who've been in the hospital and they have IVs, and you have the pumps that help to administer the medication to you. The pump itself is considered a device, and there are a wholly separate set of regulations that go along with ensuring that they do what they say they're supposed to do, and that there's backups that are in place for that. And so why are there different regulations? As we talked earlier, there's different regions around the world. And we talked about the Food and Drug Administration, and we talked about the European Medicines Agency, EMA, and then there's others. So the regions just broadly include the US, Health Canada, Latin America, EMA, Sweden, and I pull Sweden out specifically because it tends to be one of the countries that will take the lead in helping to evaluate products in Europe. The UK has their health authority called the MHRA. They have since Brexit, they've cleaved off. So now they're doing their own. They have their own regulatory authority, very similar to the FDA. The PDMA is in Japan, and the Chinese FDA as well. They just call it the Chinese FDA. Most of the regions comply with the International Conference of Harmonization, or ICH. And ICH provides a universal standard by which countries or regions can develop products that they're in harmony with one another. So they look at things such as the number of trials, the type of preclinical models, common endpoints, patient populations. And a lot of this is driven by something called the CTD, the Common Technical Document. And the CTD is a way of submitting your applications to the FDA or the health authorities for review. Years and years ago, you didn't have Common Technical Documents, so each individual region had their own way that they wanted to see applications submitted. So the FDA would look different than what you would submit to the UK or Sweden. It would look completely different than what you would submit down in Latin America. And Japan and China are just completely different in and of their own. So the International Conference for Harmonization was created, and they developed, again, as I said, the Common Technical Document. So applications for products across uniformly across regions look the same. So what you submit to the US and what you submit to the EMA look the same. There are regional differences in some of the administrative work, but by and far, the way that the applications are laid out, the way they're presented, the way the data are presented are all the same. So it makes the work on behalf of the sponsor or the company a lot easier, and it also helps the health authorities because they also talk with one another. So the FDA and the EMA talk. Obviously, the FDA and Health Canada talk quite a bit, and the EMA and the UK. They all talk with one another, and they have a collaborative effort and a collaborative way of communicating with one another. So everybody can see the same information, and they all have an understanding of what data have gone where. As I said, while most countries utilize ICH, some countries will seek population-specific studies. And the countries that really do that are Japan and China. Will request specific studies evaluating the Asian population. I know I've done studies for Japan and China, and also with South Korea. And just because of the genetic makeup and the population differences, doses may differ. So if in the United States, Caucasians will take a 50 milligram tablet, in Japan, just because of the genetic differences in the population and the build, it may only be a 30 milligram tablet. 50 milligrams may be too much. So you have to do specific patient population and ensure that it's applicable and appropriate for the population that you're going to be investigating. All of this needs to be taken account during the clinical and regulatory development of a product. So as you start to evaluate, as companies start to evaluate where they're going to develop a product, they need to think about the wheres. Where is this going to be developed? What are going to be some of the indications? Other considerations are for various populations that need to be taken into serious consideration include gender, the elderly, and believe it or not, elderly is defined as over 60. So when I hit 60 a number of years ago, that did not make me feel very good. But it's that's what is considered elderly nowadays. Pediatrics are neonates through age 17. And there are a completely separate set of guidelines for the pediatric populations, and what the FDA looks for and what Europe looks for are a little bit different. And then looking at Japan and China, again, are completely different. Pregnant women, women of childbearing potential, now need to be included in the clinical studies. Years ago, women of childbearing potential were specifically excluded. And up until about 15, 20 years ago, women were specifically excluded. So studies were done primarily on men. And then when women started taking the product, sometimes they reacted differently to the drug. And that's where the FDA and other health authorities have stepped in to ensure that there is a more uniform evaluation of the drug across specific populations. Ethnic differences. How does a product work in Caucasians, African American, Latino, Native American, Asians? And the regulations and trial designs are constantly being refined to ensure as many populations are studied as possible. And the FDA is now, especially in the phase 3, which are the large efficacy studies that companies do, the agency is really pushing hard to ensure that there are very clear populations that are being evaluated, and they'll ask to specifically have representation from African American, Native American, Asian, Latino, so on and so forth. And when your statistical analysis is done, the statistical analysis will also be run on those populations. So it's incumbent on the regulatory professional to ensure that the company understands that these different populations need to be assessed. And also from a biostatistical perspective, it's important that the companies understand that they better be doing the statistics, because once their application is submitted to the health authorities, you can be guaranteed they're going to be looking at the populations. So you better make sure that you have the answers that could potentially come up to the questions that are going to be asked. My favorite phrase from a regulatory perspective, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way, is "it depends." Companies will often ask, well, what if we do this, or what if we do that? What if we want to do one large trial as opposed to two smaller trials? Well, it depends. So, and that's really where the experience and the expertise of the regulatory individual comes into play. So how does this all fit together? It seems like it's a lot of moving pieces, and indeed it is. The regulations and drug development are specific to various phases, phase 1 through phase 4. Phase 1 are your healthy volunteer studies for the most part. So you're really just looking at what the activity of that drug. Does the drug do anything from a pharmacokinetic or a pharmacodynamic perspective? So you're looking at that. Phase 2, you start looking at some of the safety issues primarily, and you start getting a perspective of what doses should we take into phase 3. Your phase 3 are your large studies that are done in the specific population that you intend to market, to whom you intend to market. And phase 4 are your post-marketing studies. It's important to recognize that in general, only about 5% of programs that are started in phase 1 will result in the approval of the product. And when you think about the millions and millions of dollars that are spent with developing a drug, it really helps to put in perspective why oftentimes drugs cost so much, because that development cost has to be absorbed somewhere. And I'm sure it's the same thing in your industry. There's a lot of failures, and that development cost has to be absorbed somehow. And it's oftentimes very difficult to try and explain that to people. Not necessarily the purview of the regulatory professional, but they are things that come up as questions. So again, in general, companies are going to try to determine which regions or countries that they want to develop their product in. They'll look at various regions, and they'll try to pick a lead country from whom to seek regulatory advice. So once they decide they're going to develop a product, or they have a molecule that seems to work in asthma, they'll make a determination. Do we want to start with the US? Is there going to be a higher population of individuals in Europe that will make it easier for us to do the investigation? If we're looking at a very specific population that may be hard to recruit people in the United States, for example, because we have so many drugs that are on the market, and we treat people much more aggressively in the US than other parts of the world. So sometimes finding populations for individuals makes it a little bit more difficult. So you go into some of the countries like Romania and Bulgaria and Latvia. It used to be the Ukraine was rich, and many companies, my company included, have had to drop the Ukraine for obvious reasons. So when you're looking at which countries, and then consequently which health authorities you need to work with, again, it's looking at some of the key indicators of what indication, what's the patient population, what's the rationale, what are the endpoints, and then other reasons can be consulted secondarily. I think one of the things that's important to note is, what if the advice differs? When you seek your regulatory advice, let's say you go to the FDA and you get specific advice on how your drug is supposed to be developed. And then you go to Europe, they can tell you something different. And it's not unusual that happens. Again, the two organizations do speak with one another, but they have very specific ideas of what they want to do. In one country, for example, they may want, in your early stages, they may want you to do 3 dose levels of a particular product, where in Europe they want you to do 4. Now, how do you rectify that? So, and of course, it's, a lot of it's about saving the money. So companies have to figure that out, and the regulatory individual will help companies negotiate through and provide insight into what would seem to make the most sense. As I said, different regulatory authorities have different ways to work with the sponsors. To my mind, FDA tends to be more flexible. Again, not that I'm that biased, but we have, in the United States, we are very fortunate that we have processes here that are much more open and much more collaborative than they are in Europe. Europe is more regimented with regard to timings of meetings, proposals, advice. And if you think about it, obviously the European Medicines Agency is comprised of multiple countries. And each of the individual countries may have specific guidelines and things that they're looking for on a local or a national level. So they really do need to be a lot more regimented with specific timings about when you can request a meeting. They have to be done on pretty much just on a quarterly basis, and they'll tell you when documents have to be in, when you can seek advice, when you'll get the advice. So it's not as flexible as it is in the US. And in the US, if you have questions, you can email the FDA or talk to the individuals there. And in Europe, it's not quite that easy. And again, as I mentioned before, different countries can take the lead and provide advice on behalf of the EMA. I think it's important to note that if a sponsor or a company seeks advice from a health authority, the anticipation from that health authority is that the sponsor is going to follow that advice. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what happens if the advice differs? And it will oftentimes. FDA will often acknowledge that the risk is really to the sponsor or the company if they don't follow the advice, unless it's a real issue with regard to safety. If they tell you to do 4 dose levels and you only do 3, then the risk is that the company needs to take into account. The EMA has a lower tolerance for seeking advice and not following it. They really see that as a waste of time. And I can tell you from personal experience that that it's really not a good thing. And trying to maintain a positive relationship with Europe when you're not listening to what they say does really not bode well for a company. How do companies make all of this work? You really have to have a close collaboration between development and regulatory within the company. There has to be a very close collaboration with health authorities, and that's really going to be successful to your drug development. Talking to your health authorities early and actively engaged with them is going to dramatically increase the probability of success. Of course, the product itself and how that molecule or how that product works is going to be the main indicator of success. So your engagement with the health authority doesn't necessarily guarantee success. It's the product itself, but it really helps to talk to the agency because, remember that they see products across the board from all different companies. So they have information available to them that we don't. And they will often provide you with guidance as to what you should consider and what you shouldn't consider, and different ways to look at things. It's important to be as open and transparent as possible, especially from a safety perspective. I can tell you from experience at one company that I worked at, there was a product that they were developing for stroke, and there were significant liver issues that were identified. And the company, the higher up in the company decided to provide the data in the application, but they didn't really call it out. And it was a significant safety issue. That particular product went to an advisory committee, and it was brought to light, and the company got a royal reaming from the FDA and from other health authorities, and it also ended up as a lawsuit from the shareholders for withholding evidence and trying to manipulate stock prices. So it can, it just doesn't affect what happens at the FDA. It can affect the entire company itself. But in the end, it's a business decision on how companies choose to move forward. And that's it. I think that's I'm talked out. So I think what you can see is that regulatory affairs is fairly complex. There are universities around the United States that have master's programs in regulatory affairs, in much the same way that they do for other areas of specialization. And it's becoming more and more of a niche in the industry. And it's people need, when they're in the regulatory affairs group, they tend to grow up in that kind of environment. It's not something that you just automatically switch from one to the other, because it does require a lot of experience to be able to help companies negotiate their way through some of the complexities of drug development and regulatory development. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thanks, Sandy, for an informative and interesting presentation. I do see one question here on the chat board from Fred Hartman, and he's wondering if there is any or much meaningful effort to harmonize or standardize regulatory affairs across the many regional regulations. That's something in the cards.
That part of the international Committee for Harmonization, ICH, really helps to define that because there are specific guidances by which certain products are supposed to be developed. That really helps to direct your the regulatory environment, but at the same time, health authorities are supposed to follow ICH, but if they have a specific predilection for not doing it, they don't have to. It's a strong guidance, but not a mandate.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So again, part of it is part of the role of regulatory affairs is being able to understand what those nuances are, and being able to understand that Europe may look one way and the FDA may look another way, or Canada may want something a little bit different. So trying to understand those discrete differences and help the company move along.
Mm. Thank you. I also have another question from another attendee, Ms. Vivian Gray, and she has a question she would like to present.
Okay.
Hi, wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm a consultant for the pharmaceutical industry and dissolution testing, and so
Okay.
I'm very interested in this fact that there's a new regulatory agency in the UK. I don't know how I missed that, but I just want to know your experience with that agency and how long has it been around and is it functioning and so on. And it's MHRA.
MHRA. It's actually not a new organization. When the UK was part of the European Union, they were all together. So MHRA was no different than the health authority in France or the MPA in Sweden. But when Brexit occurred, they had to cleave off. So the MHRA had to extricate themselves from the European Union. So that they're not a new organization. They've always been there, but now they have to function independent of the EMA.
Has anyone had any dealings with them as far as, getting drugs approved just or in the UK, whether they're, march to their own drummer or they're just like everybody else?
Yeah, Vivian, that's a very good question. And by and far, they tend to follow the EMA. They're not that much different. It's been my experience that there is no difference at this point, but at the same time, they're still so new. They're it's a new old organization. So they have to decide if they want to continue following what things are in the regulations through the EMA, or whether they want to put a specific United Kingdom spin on the regulations. So they're still so new. They're still so new. They can barely spell MHRA at this point, let alone worry about much else.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sandy. I have one other question from Dr. Ambahovsky. He's wondering, does the FDA rely entirely on safety and efficacy data from companies? How does the FDA ensure the data is reliable and complete?
And that's a very good question. Yeah, we look, there's a number of different things that are looked at when products are evaluated. They look at the preclinical data, the animal studies. How do the animal studies predict what's going to happen in humans? And looking at things like dosing. Are there any toxicity issues that show up in animals, and how does that translate into humans, or does it? Different animal models will demonstrate different toxicities that don't necessarily translate into humans. The closest model that we have are obviously monkeys, but in preclinical models right now, and monkeys are so unbelievably expensive that you really have to, companies really choose the studies very well. And if they can use a rodent model to help inform how they're going to move forward, they will. So they look at the preclinical. They'll also look at the chemistry and the manufacturing. How is this product being developed? and looking from a chemical perspective, what are the excipients that are put in there? Is there anything that could potentially be a contraindication? And then looking at the totality of data from all the way from phase 1 through phase 3, and then making sure that what you're seeing is pretty much, and I'll use the words, telling the same story. Are you seeing a build on that data? So is your phase 1 your human volunteers, or it could be patients depending on the disease entity? Is that helping to inform your phase 2? And are you following through with the phase 2? Is phase 2 helping to inform and guiding what needs to be done in phase 3? So they look across the totality of data. It's not just, I mean, the safety and efficacy, of course, are paramount. And there's also the additional challenge of what if you look at companies, or if you look at diseases like an advanced cancer, for example, where you look at the benefit risk ratio, and obviously you want to have a clearer benefit than you do risk. Some patients are willing, and it's kind of an ethical conundrum. Some patients are willing to accept a higher level of risk as opposed to the benefit, because it's something that they haven't taken before, and it may benefit them. So there's a real balancing act, and oftentimes for products that are being developed and then they're being reviewed by the FDA and other health authorities, they'll take them to an advisory committee and have experts in the field opine on the data and help them to make a determination as to whether what they said they were going to do is what they actually did. Do the data support approval, or does it support additional studies being done?
I guess my question was slightly.
Light in the hall.
Yeah.
My question was, how does the FDA know that the data is reliable and complete? There's certainly examples in the generic area where companies in foreign countries will actually rip out lab notebook pages which don't support their case. I would imagine that even in the United States, in well-known pharmaceutical companies, there would be an incentive to, let's just say, delete data which doesn't support their case.
Yeah.
How does the FDA prevent that from happening?
There are checks and balances that are put in place. A lot of it has to do with being able to show the historical data from like for lab studies, for example. And then when from clinical studies, you have electronic data capture. So all of that is stored, and the FDA has access to all of that. So they're able to look at that. And if they have any questions, they go back and they start digging deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. One of the beauties of having the CTD, the Common Technical Document, and now it's called the eCTD because it's all electronic, they have the ability to dig from, the high level, as I call, the safe and effective in a small white pill, all the way down to what happened on the first visit for patient number 3 from this study. And they can dig down to that discrete level. But I can tell you that does falsifying data happen? Yeah, it does. And there's we'd like to believe that most of the time it's caught. The FDA is pretty good at sniffing things out. Studies are audited by the FDA and other health authorities, as well as the chemistry and manufacturings are audited by different health authorities. I've gone on audits around the world looking at different manufacturing sites in different labs, and you do the exact same thing that you were just talking about, Ron. And you look at the lab books. You look at how they, why they do one thing one way, and how, sometimes how it's a different way. If their processes and procedures say that they're supposed to be different rooms for different things, and the way that the products either are developed or composed or filled, that there should be like a sterile barrier in between. So you look at all these different things, so they all come into account. But I've had experience in the past with one company where we were developing products for breast cancer, and products that had been on the market for a while. And somehow, and I wish I could remember how, but this was 20 years ago, we somehow found out that an investigator in Canada had falsified all of his data, all of it. And because he wanted a really good publication. And he got a great publication, then he also got 20 years after that. But what we ended up having to do once that came to light is we had to the company had to rerun all of the clinical studies and all of the data, taking that investigator's data out, and see if the statistics held up, see if the p-values held up. And fortunately they did. But then coming off of that were congressional hearings and a bunch of other things. And if you've never had the pleasure of going through something like that, it's quite the experience. It's something that you want to do once in your life and never do again.
Thank you. That's a good answer.
Certainly. Yeah.
And Sandy, I know you have another engagement to get to.
Mm-hmm.
If you have another minute, Ron's question sort of suggests another. When you mentioned the history of thalidomide and the
Mm-hmm.
company that withheld data that showed that the birth defects that could occur.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, as I understand, thalidomide is an enantiomeric mixture, one of which the enantiomer they found later to be anti-cancer agent. I'm not sure if that's marketed or not, but it sort of raises the question: is drugs that come through the pipeline that are enantiomeric mixtures, do they require basically a larger investment of time and energy to study to make sure that both enantiomers are safe, or that one is not better than other?
Yeah, they actually they do. I worked on a product years ago for prostate cancer, and so both enantiomers had to be looked at. And then basically one of them was dropped, and then the product was developed with from the other side. So it was a product called bicalutamide. So yeah, they do. It does require some additional investigation. And I think thalidomide is a very good example. And as has been found out, that it actually does work in some cancer patients. And again, this is one of those things where you can take drugs and they can be repurposed. But you have to start looking again. It's the benefit risk, it's the patient population. How do you ensure that only specific patients are getting that? The FDA and other authorities have put in different kinds of drug registries where you have to guarantee, and it's basically just you have to provide the data that verify that patient is eligible to take that drug. And then the FDA will follow them. So, and then the companies will follow them as well. And, you have to do that for quite a while.
Yeah, very nice. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you, Sandy, for an interesting and very illuminating presentation tonight. And wish you and your kitty cat a pleasant evening. And
that was Lucy. She's held off as long as she could to not be a pain in the neck. So I have to give her due. Thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to talk with you. And if anybody has any questions, any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will provide a copy of my slides so that y'all can take a look at them again. If they prompt any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you. I'll give you a real clap, not a virtual clap. But
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So our next meeting is April 13th. We're having Ron Turi talk about the evolution of battery technology for the emerging global electrical vehicle market. So very interesting EV battery talk. So thank you very much for attending.
Okay, good night, all.
Good night, all.